Today is July 12th, 2007. I am Jessica Clark. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Cullum, North Dakota. To start with, can you please state your full name?
My name is Roy Fred Nill.
Is the Fred after somebody?
My Herman's name was Frederick, and then I guess mine had started out Frederick, but somebody shortened it down to Fred.
Where were you born?
On a farm about 7.5 miles from here.
And when were you born?
When? December 20th of 1926.
Did you ever hear any stories about your birth?
Yes, of course the old Russians were pretty self-sufficient, and supposedly my dad was the only one present when I was born, no midwife.
Can you share your earliest childhood memory with us?
My earliest memories. Well, my real earliest memories are probably from about the first grade in school. And we had a walk to school, of course, and it was uphill both ways. So I don't know about what else. And I went, there was a country school 2.5 miles from our farm, and I went through the 8 grades there.
Do you remember what the name of the school was?
The name of the school was Marycourt Number 4, Marycourt School District. Yeah.
How old were you when you started school?
Oh, I imagine I was 5. I was 6 that next December then.
Thinking back when you started school, do you remember what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Well, I always, from as far back as I can remember, I know I didn't want to live in North Dakota with the cold weather.
What was school like back then when you were growing up?
Well, of course, it was a one-room school, and we didn't have a lot of students in school like some of the older ones talk about, but I imagine the most that we ever had in school where I was going was about 10 or 12. But that changed. A family moved out of there that was a large family. So most of the years that I was going to school, it was probably 7 or 8, and was just actually 3 families that the kids came from.
Do you remember the family names?
Well, the Chankeys for one thing, and Galls, Gall, Gall family lived there, and us, the Nill family.
The Jankeys, were they any relation to Elma Janke
Yes.
from Gackle?
Oh no, that's a different. There is an Alma Chankey. In fact, the only Chankey of that family that's left is Alma and a sister out west. I think there were 11 of them in that family, but Alma lives in Yankton, South Dakota. And my older sister was married to Emil Chankey of that family.
You said you were in a one-room schoolhouse. Can you describe what a one-room schoolhouse looked like?
Well, the one that we were in was a big square building. A lot of them older ones in that Marycourt district were, these, I don't know, they were probably 20 feet wide and about 30 feet in length. But the one we were was a big square building. Oh, it had to be at least 30 by 30. It was a big building, and it had windows all along the east side for light. Of course, we didn't have no electricity, and the north side. Now, why in the world in North Dakota they wanted a whole wall of windows on the north side? I've never been able to figure that out, because all we had was a little pot-bellied stove in the corner for heating it with coal, and teachers' duty were get the ash out of the furnace in the morning and put more coal in. But the coal were in the building. There was a room for the coal in the building, so they didn't. Some of the other teachers and they had to go outside to get the coal and wood. But in this particular school, they had a room in there for the coal and wood for starting the fires. And there were some pretty cold days. I mean, we didn't get very far from the stove when it was too cold. I remember back in 1936, I don't know, I suppose I was in about the third or fourth grade, and we had such a severe winter. And we were the furthest from the school. The other one family lived within a block of the school, and the Chankey family lived less than a half a mile from the school. But we were 2.5. So consequently, for during the winter of '36, and we had such fierce cold and winter and snow, we didn't go to school for 2 weeks. I mean, it was just impossible to walk, and the parents couldn't by any means haul us with anything, and we just missed the. They kept the school going, but we had to make that up afterwards.
If there were only 3 families attending the school, where did the teachers stay?
At the family that lived within a block of the school. Most of the teachers stayed there in my time, yeah. Well, then later on, that family had moved out, and my sister Ruth Janke, they lived on a farm about a mile from school, and I know they boarded a number of teachers. But they didn't have any children going to school at the time.
So when you were going to school, did you have the same teacher for a couple of years, or would they change every year?
Well, through this 8 years, I would say we had maybe 5. There was 2 or 3 of them that stayed a couple of years. So.
Did you have a favorite teacher?
But yes, well, actually 2. One gal when I was in the 6th grade was Mrs. Oxenrider, and she was an excellent teacher. You know, she wasn't that young anymore. She was married at the time, and incidentally, you know, if they could find a teacher that was single, a married woman lost her job.
Really?
If they were willing, I mean, if they found a gal that was willing to come and teach, and they had hired a married one, I mean, she had priority over it. Luckily, that never happened. I mean, this Mrs. Oxenrider was married, and she taught for 2 years. And then in the 7th grade, I had an excellent teacher too, by the name of, escapes me. I know her first name was Esther, but I thought I'd never forget her. She was such a good teacher. That's more than I can say for the one I had in the 8th grade. I mean, no, he wasn't cut out to be a teacher, but we got along.
So were most of your teachers women, or were they men?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. There was, let's see, Mr. Leet and Mr. Huffman. Well, yeah, 2 men, and the rest were women.
What was special about Mrs. Oxenrider and then Esther?
Well, I mean, she had so much patience with us, and you know, we never had everybody in a grade. Like, you know, some schools had 8 grades, and they had some kids in every grade. We never were. There used to be I never had less than 3 in the class that I was in, and with 7 or 8 kids in school, so the other grades, they weren't all there in a grade. I mean, some were 1st graders and some were 3rd graders and so on, but we never had, that I can remember, that we'd had all kids in all 8 of the grades. So, and then Irwin, that's what Esther Irwin, I mean, she knew what she was doing, and she loved being a teacher. And that's with Mrs. Oxenrider too. I can remember one incident with this Mrs. Oxenrider. She was a patient gal, if there ever was one, because, you know, with a bunch of kids like that. But we had this one guy in school, and he just wouldn't pay attention. It wasn't that he couldn't learn, but he just, everything was funny. And she'd ask him to do something, and he'd laugh. Well, one day the whole situation got the best of her. And he was sitting there laughing, and she walked by with a book, and she cracked him over the head. And they were living close to school. He went out and says, "I'm going home." He said it in German, because all these kids could talk German. He's going home. Well, he did. They were only a block from he'd come. About 15 minutes later, Buddy was coming back, and his mother was about 10 steps behind him. And he was looking for a place to sit. Today, they'd take a guy like that, and I imagine they'd send him to counselors all over the country. But I hadn't seen that guy for many years, and then in 91, the town of Marycourt had a centennial. There were very few people living there. And by gee, here was Buddy. He was back. He had a family, was a grandfather living out in Washington State someplace. I'd never forget that guy.
So what would typically happen when people misbehave in class?
Well, you'd have to stand in the corner, or things got too bad. They let your parents know things weren't going right. That was the only guy that that I know that capital punishment was used on. You hear other people talking about a teacher taking them across their knee and paddling them, but in general, we had some pretty well-behaved kids. If they come, if they'd come from a family where there was order in school too.
You mentioned that all the kids spoke German, so were all the families German-Russian?
Yes, very much so. If you wanted to find anything that wasn't German-Russian, you had to go north of Culm. That's where the Swedes and the Norwegians lived.
How far north?
Well, all the way north. You get about 2 miles north of Culm, and it's, I mean, there's a few intermixed Germans now, but it's still a big split. And in those days, I think if I'd have come home with a non-German woman for a wife, I don't know if my parents would have accepted it.
So you married a German-Russian
Yes.
woman. How about the teachers? Did they speak German?
Not very many of them, the first grade teacher I had was from a German family. And from there on, and I know it was for our own good, but that was sort of a cardinal sin. If they caught us speaking German out on the playground, hey, there isn't anything we could have done that was worse. I mean, it was for our own good. At least we learned the language, which I'm sure if our parents would have had their way, it probably would have been the same way as Lawrence Welk. I mean, they'd have sent us to a German school, and whether we learned English or not wouldn't have concerned them too much.
Did your parents ever learn English?
Well, they learned enough to get by with. My mother had spent some time in going to school in her childhood, here in this country. But of course, my dad was 18 when he came, so he had gone to a German school. He could read German, and he could, use arithmetic, because that stays the same no matter where you are. But his speaking, well, eventually, there were a number of people not very far from where we lived that were, speaking English. And when it ever come to things like elections and things like that, well, they had to learn to speak English because the people on the election board were probably not German. So it's not like now, now they make a big effort to teach Spanish so that nobody's left behind. Hey, this is America. If they want to live here, they should learn to speak the language. I'm glad that somebody stuck to it and made me capable of speaking a language.
When you started school, did you know how to speak English?
Yes, I did, because I had 2 older sisters, so that helped. I know when they started school, they talk about the boy. Some of them come to school and could hardly speak a word of English. But no, I had 2 sisters. And, well, that one sister was 10 years older than I am, so there was you know, good opportunity to, and they knew what I needed, so they helped out.
Did you have a lot of homework when you were going to school?
Not a lot, as they say nowadays, but I mean, usually about the only homework we had if we didn't get it done in school. If we had time to do it in school, and if we fiddled around and didn't get it done, we had homework.
So when you did have homework, would your older sisters help you with it?
Oh yes.
How about your parents? Would they ever
Well,
help you?
the parents were not much help. They tried. Well, my mother, like I said, she was 6 years old when they come to this country, but the country school was a long ways away, and she was one of the older ones, so she really didn't spend a lot of time going to school. She could read and write a little, and eventually, when the girls left home, she was able to write a letter to them. But my dad never learned to write in English. He could write in German.
Could he write in Russian?
No, that's one. They didn't pick up very much Russian. A few things that they picked up that we really think, like sauerkraut is German. Well, that's not. They picked that up while they were in Russia. That was not a basic German. And all these dough dishes, most of that was picked up in Russia because times were tough and they had to eat what was there. But, our son here had an exchange student from Germany this past school year. And, when they offered her some of these German dishes that we think are German, boy, the sauerkraut, she took one taste and she wouldn't even eat it. And the dough dishes, too, they were not familiar to her at all. Of course, in those days, it depends a lot what part of Germany these people came from. These Hermans and the bunch that I come from were Schwabs from Schwabenland, which is, I think, southern Germany. And this gal that they had was from way northern Germany, along the coast, way north. Well, she was such a wonderful young girl. I mean, they hated to see her go home. And she was in no hurry to go home. She had such a good year here. The kids out there, there was Mark's youngest daughter was about the same age as this gal was, and they had horses to ride out there, and they had snowmobiles and four-wheelers, and of course she had never, they don't dare get a driver's license until they're 18 or 19, I guess. So she had never driven a vehicle. Well, these guys changed it. She drove everything on the yard before she was through. Yeah.
So when you were going to school, what type of subjects were they teaching you?
Well, reading, writing, and arithmetic, of course. And, and in those days, I don't think they even called it English. I think they called it reading. I know in the lower grades they called it reading class. Reading class and arithmetic and geography was, for some reason or other, there was quite a bit of emphasis put on geography. And history, well, American history, and it's, when I think back, if what I studied the history in the school, there never would have been a civil war. Because I don't remember that they ever mentioned anything about slavery. I mean, we studied the Civil War, the North and the South, but I don't think there was ever anything mentioned that was fought because of slavery. Of course, slavery was not the only thing. Lincoln fought the war to preserve the nation. But, history just, they do the same thing today, man. You read what some of these things are supposed to be. Hey, they didn't happen that way. It might look a little nicer, but they didn't happen that way. And I know after, I had started on this here and looked around for some information. I don't know, did I tell you, we had 5 children. And one of our boys lives in Jamestown, and our oldest daughter lives at Cogswell, so- down the Sioux line a ways there, and then Tim that lives in James has got a twin brother who lives in Manchester, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis, and our youngest daughter lives in the area over. They have a farm, cattle operation. They live here. And then I went, Tim, they were here last Sunday, and I asked him, I said, what really did you study in American history? Was there anything ever said about slavery or anything like that? Boy, he said, if it was so very little. Of course, I mean, they knew, because they weren't that young anymore. They knew and had heard some of those things, but their history books did not say much about slavery in the U.S. So when I always look at history, I sort of take it with a grain of salt. I mean, it's what I know and what these guys are trying to tell me. I read a recent book here. It said From the Depths. And I got it from our son for Father's Day. And it's the history of the battleship Indianapolis, which is the ship that carried the components for the A-bomb to the Tinian Islands. And this gentleman that wrote it was a part of that ship's crew. And to begin with, they were also stationed at Pearl Harbor when the Japs invaded. But about 5 hours before the Japs come, they were ordered out of there. And I've always felt that the Americans had broken that Japanese code and knew there was a battle an armada coming this way. But they ordered them out to save them. Well, the politicians and even the Army and Navy admirals or whatever have you, they knew, and that's why they sent that ship out. But they had this, there was an awful lot of opposition about U.S. going to war. And they thought them chaps would come over there and drop a few bombs and it would get people together. And it did. But, I mean, it was an awful sad way of doing it when you've got, I don't know, what was it, 5 or 6 of America's biggest battleships were harbored there at Pearl Harbor. And this guy writes it in this book, and he was a survivor of that. And he said, here it is. I believe that the Japanese code had been broken. If somebody wants to sue me, go right ahead. But that's what I believe. And then on the way back from the Tinian Islands, the captain had asked for escort, destroyer escort. And the big boy said, you don't need a destroyer, as there are no Japanese subs in there. Well, they were one day out at sea, and a sub come along and torpedoed them and sank them. And I remember some of this recent history, because after the war, the military court-martialed the captain of that ship because he had survived. The writer of this book and the captain in a small group had survived 5 days in a shark-infested ocean. But they thought they were the only ones. There was about 5 in their group, and they didn't have a life raft. They just had some pieces to hang on to in the life preservers. But when it was all said and done, there was a crew of 900 and some, and 300 had actually survived. And these guys, when they tried to court-martial him, these guys the sailors got a group together and went to Congress and said, hey, this man did not do anything wrong. What they tried to court-martial him for, because he hadn't run his ship in a zigzag like the orders were. Well, long before that had got to that was already considered foolishness. Because these big carriers and stuff, that zigzagging didn't change that, whether that torpedo could hit them or not. They even went so far to bring the captain of the sub, the Japanese sub, he was alive yet after the war. They brought him over to testify that this captain wasn't going zigzag. Well, this man said no, he wasn't going zigzag, but it wouldn't make one bit of difference. A big ship like that, he said, we only fired 3 torpedoes to sink it. We had 1 more to go. We didn't even need it. So, I mean, and then, you know, the saddest part when it comes to that book, this Captain McKay was the name of it, the name of the captain of the ship. And he had, Truman had eventually reinstated him. I mean, took all that, you know, what do you call it? Forgiven his court martial that it wasn't right. But then the poor guy, he had one of his sons was killed in a tragic accident, and his wife fought a battle of cancer for 6 months and died. And it was just more than the poor guy could take. He took a gun to his head. But I remember when that was in the news, because that happened in 1968. So,
So with Pearl Harbor, do you remember where you were? When
oh yes, I was at home and we had I was about 15, 16 years old. But of course, we had a radio, a battery radio, and I can remember when they said that there's some. Of course, they didn't really know. I never said that first day how bad that bombing was, but I can well remember when the radio said that we were at war.
How old were you when that happened?
15 or 16, because I was 18 before the end of the war to be drafted.
So you were drafted, is that?
Yes.
How did that come about? How did they draft back then?
Well, everybody had to register for the military, and everybody was sent for a physical to see whether he'd be capable of serving, and then of course farmers, if they were married, were deferred. Well, I wasn't married, and I had another brother at home, so I wasn't eligible for a deferment.
Where did they send you for the physical?
Fort Snelling, Minnesota.
How did you get there?
By train. That's the first train ride I ever had in my life. We got on a train at Allendale. We had to come to Allendale, and I imagine in that group there must have been 30 guys, and 3 of us were drafted out of that, I know for sure.
What was the train ride like for you?
Well, it was certainly different, and they had the train out of Allendale. I think it went to the Oaks. It was one of them old ones. They had a little pot-bellied stove sitting in the corner of the car. It was a passenger type car with seats, but the only heat was that little stove in the corner. And then I don't even remember for sure. Did we leave Oaks by bus or train the rest of it? No, it was by train all the way to Minneapolis. St. Paul, Fort Snelling is, a ways out. That was an army post at the time. Now the only thing that's left of Fort Snelling is that cemetery, National Cemetery. And I had never been back to Fort Snelling until 3 years ago. My brother died, and he had retired out of the service, so he was buried at Fort Snelling.
So what was a physical like back then for the military?
Well, I mean, if you could walk and talk, I mean, you sort of almost passed. Unless you had some obvious.
So after you passed the physical, then what did they do once you passed the physical when you were in Fort Snelling?
Well, I mean, I wasn't drafted for, at least 3 months, I think. Yeah.
So they sent you back then to the farm by train?
Yes.
How did they let you know that they were calling you up?
By registered letter.
Were your parents upset when you were drafted?
Well, I think so. Really, it didn't make that much difference to me to go. I really didn't at the time, So, but they were. Well, I survived, so.
So when you were drafted, then what happened? Where did you go?
Well, we were sworn in at Fort Snelling again, and that was sort of special to me. I had a sister living in Minneapolis at the time, and I had some time off from Fort Snelling, and I went to visit her. Rode streetcars. It wasn't hard to get along around in Minneapolis. Well, you get down there now, I wouldn't attempt to drive there anymore. I mean, the crazy traffic they got, you know. And then from there, by troop train, we went to a place called Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, which was just on the outskirts of St. Louis. And I had never been back to that railroad station. I can remember when we got off the train in St. Louis for Jefferson Barracks, but now our son's been living down there for the last, it's got to be 20-some years in the St. Louis area. And that was a huge railroad station there. That, St. Louis was sort of a hub on the nation. And now they made a big museum out of it. I mean, they still got a railroad station, but not where that one was. I mean, they made a museum out of it. And there was a lot of things to see there. But the building is still the way it had been, the old terminal.
What did you think of Missouri when you first arrived?
That's a different world. A kid off of the farm. Well, incidentally, that was the first time I'd ever been to a doctor when I got that physical.
So were you ever sick when you were growing up?
Well, the regular things, mumps and measles and those kind of things, but never really anything. And somewhere down the line, I mean, I suppose the county had done it. But while we were going to school, we were vaccinated for smallpox. The one where you get that scar on your shoulder, I think. Yeah.
So when you would get the mumps and measles, like how would your parents take care of you?
Well, they put you to bed and fed you soup if you could keep it down, and survived.
When you were in the military, you went to Missouri. Did you serve your entire time in Missouri?
No, I was shipped to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I thought, wow, this is a big deal. Fort Knox is the tanker capital of the Army. And I had seen these movies about the Desert Fox with the tanks in Egypt and Arabia and all that stuff, and it looked so glamorous. Well, the inside of a tank is anything but glamorous. When you fired those big guns off of there, that thing you choked in gunpowder smoke. So it wasn't nearly as glamorous. I got to drive about everything in the line of tanks that the Army had at that time. And then later on, after my basic training, I was shipped. I had orders to Fort Ord, California. Well, before I got there, they had dropped the atomic bomb, and I wasn't shipped. They sent me to Camp Roberts, California, where it was a training camp. And of course, by then, a lot of these older guys that had spent time in the service were discharged. They had a point system. If you were in this long, and you got out. So consequently, there weren't a lot of people left to do the training in these camps. So they stuck some corporal stripes on me and made me a cadre to teach kids how to be soldiers. And I had been 6 months in the Army. I didn't know much about soldiering myself. And I spent a winter in California, and then that Camp Roberts was closed. So lo and behold, where did they send me? Back to Fort Knox. Then I spent another 7 or 8 months at Fort Knox in supposedly teaching these new recruits, and they were all kids like I was. They were 18. Some of them come out of New York City, had never even ridden in a vehicle. They had subways. They didn't need a car or something. And of course, we were supposed to teach these guys how to drive army trucks and tanks, which we didn't do much to them. I mean, they got to ride in one and but that's about it. I don't know what's happened to any of them since. I've only been in contact with one guy that I took basic training with, and I had lost contact from here a couple of years ago. We were looking at some pictures, and here was this picture of this young guy from Iowa that I had known quite well. And I remembered the town that he was from, so I wrote a letter to the Alumni Association of that town. And of course, he wasn't there anymore, but they forwarded my letter to, he was still living, he was from Iowa, and he was still living in some city in Iowa within about 100 miles of where he had grown up. And he answered my letters and said what had happened. You know, he had, of course, gotten married and had a family, and he had worked in a bank. And right about the time I sent that letter to him, they were celebrating his 50th year at working at that bank. And he sent a picture of himself. I wouldn't have known him if I'd have walked by him on the street there, because he was just a small young guy when I knew him, and now he was a pretty good-sized gentleman. But I've never gotten around to getting over there. And it should have been so easy, because a couple of years ago, our oldest granddaughter moved to Storm Lake, Iowa. Her husband got a job there, and they moved to, which is only about 100 miles of where this gentleman lives at. But we were down there once, and it was in the winter time, and we were kind of in a hurry to get back. And well, since then we've never got down to visit. She still lives in Storm Lake, but we we sent cards at Christmas time, so we're still in contact. I still hope to get a chance to go back and see him.
So did you enjoy your time in the service?
Ups and downs, yeah, some.
What were some of the ups?
Well, you always had somebody around you. You had comradeship, and of course the downs, especially after the war, it seemed kind of silly. What are we supposed to be teaching soldiers here? But all we wanted to do was go back home. But it was an experience for a young guy like me at the time.
You were born in 1926, right?
Yes.
So you spent a good portion of your childhood in what is known as the Dirty 30s.
I remember them too well.
Can you tell us about them?
Well, what I remember most of the dirty 30s, pastures were short, and we ended up herding cows along the railroad tracks. There were cuts there, and there was water there, so a little more grass grew there. So as a kid, it seems like it was a lifetime. You imagine when I look back now, it probably was 4 or 5 years of the worst of the 30s. But there were one year, the government came and bought the cattle because we just could not get feed together for them. No crop, not a thing. That one year, they never took a harvest machine out. What little had grown, they tried cutting for hay. And so, I mean, my childhood is not a real happy one when I look back at the things like that. I mean, we were poor. But to boot, my folks had built up a farm in 1928 and had borrowed money for everything. They put new buildings on it, and in 28 and by 29, of course, when things really come apart, I think the only reason they didn't lose the farm was they owed so much against it, nobody wanted it. They just hoped that they would stick it out and pay for it. And they did. I don't know how, but they did. I mean, I still own the land. We had bought another farm here east of town. We didn't live there all my married life, but I lived there through. When we first got married, we still lived on that farm where my folks had started.
Where is that farm at?
Oh, it's about 7.5 miles southeast of here, along the Sioux Line tracks.
Is the house that you grew up in still standing?
The houses, yes.
Oh,
I
bet.
mean, we had added on to it later on, but the house that I was born in is still standing.
If we have time, we'd love to take you out there and get some footage
Welcome.
of that. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Let's see. Did you ever experience a dust storm?
Oh, yes. There were dust storms, lots of them. So the sky got dark. And that one year, even the pastures were good. They were so bare from grass that they were blowing dust. And you know, one of the things that kept us going, living along the Sioux Line tracks, of course, when they kicked out the broken used railroad ties, the landowners could pick them up for fuel. Of course, there were no trees around. That's the only wood we had to burn.
You mentioned that the government, one year the government bought your cattle. What did they do with the cattle?
The ones that they figured could survive, they shipped to the stockyards in St. Paul. And some of them that were old and didn't look like they could make it, they shot them out at the farm and buried them. I remember that.
They just bury them, like just dig a grave and mass
Yeah,
grave?
out in the pasture. Just, you know, a guy could take that meat, but you know, when I was a kid, for some reason or other, we always had cattle around, but we only ate pork and chicken. We didn't eat beef. You know, they were killing those cattle. They could have taken any part of them off of there, but no, they didn't eat beef, so they didn't take them.
How did your family keep food on the table? Was that hard in the Dirty 30s?
Well, it was mighty hard. Of course, eventually, you know, there come what they called the WPA, a Workers' Progress, and out there, my dad went to help gravel roads. They used a wagon with the planks on it that they shoveled the sand on by hand, and of course, when they dumped it out on the road, they had a means of tipping those planks so they didn't have to shovel it off. But it was all loaded by hand. And he worked a number, that was usually in the wintertime. In the summertime, those WPA projects didn't. Now, here in Cullen, there was a WPA project that built the school gym. But they worked on that the year around because the people living in town didn't have anything to do in the summertime. So those projects worked the year around. The school is still using that auditorium here. Yeah. No, them were tough times. I hope that nobody ever has to go through them again.
Was it hard for your mom to keep the house clean during those dust storms and things?
Well, you know, like I said, they had built a new house, so our house was a little better than a lot of houses. But some people, you know, had some older windows in, and that dust seeped in.
How about something that I've heard people talk about is grasshoppers? Did you have
Yes, grasshoppers. And one year, especially, you know, they flew in, I think they said from Kansas, but at the middle of the day when the sun was up high there, you could look up and there was a cloud of grasshoppers. The sky was black. And where they decided to land, when they got through, there wasn't much left. They even ate the onions in the garden.
How did your parents cope with all of this during the
Well, I don't think they had a few milk cows, and they always had a few chickens, so we always had food. I mean, it was never that we didn't have food, but it was pretty much the same thing, you know. They'd buy flour. Well, actually, in Cullen at one time there was a mill, and you could take a load of flour, of wheat to town, and in exchange for it, you get, I don't know, 200-300 pounds of flour. So flour was comparatively cheap. I mean, I don't ever remember that we were without flour. Sometimes without sugar, but not without flour. Which didn't, I remember some guys in the Army that I talked to that grew up in New York City. And it was a lot tougher there because they didn't have chickens to eat. So in that respect, the guys on the farm were better off in the 30s than people that lived in the cities.
Um, what about before you were drafted in World War II? How was the war affecting farm life?
Well, not to a large extent. I mean, you couldn't buy tires without a permit. And when the war started, we didn't have a tractor. We were still farming with horses. Well, then my dad had made a deal to buy a tractor. And by the time it came, they didn't have rubber tires to put on it, so they sent it out on steel. Steel wheel tractors were not the new, but it was all those bigger ones. Now this was a small tractor that all those size tractors had been on rubber for a number of years. But when we finally got, we used that for about 2 years till we were able to get tires for it. And of course, in those days, there weren't no combines around. We either did the harvesting with a header, which I don't know, a lot of people around the country never saw, or it was a machine that cut the grain and then brought it up on a wagon, and then you stacked it till threshing time come. And the rest of it was harvested with a binder and bundles. Of course, you had bundles, so you had to be out there shocking them up. And then when it come threshing time, you pitched them in to the wagon and from the wagon into the threshing machine. I've often said if these young guys would have to farm like that, it wouldn't take long and wheat prices would be $20 a bushel because they wouldn't be out there doing it.
So it was labor intensive.
Very much so. And haymaking the same way. We did have a buck rake that you had 2 horses on it, and when the hay was raked on a windrow, then you used this bucker to push it up to a stack. And some people had hay stackers, but we never had one. So we pitched it out on a stack. And in the wintertime, when you needed for feed, you went out there again and pitched it on the wagon and brought it home. So labor was, and I don't know, for some reason or other, no matter how nice the weather was, livestock was in the barn. I mean, horses were in the barn all winter long, so you always had a barn to clean. Now, these guys got nice riding horses and they make them spend the winter out there behind a windbreak. But ours were always in the barn.
So how many horses did you have when you were growing up on the farm?
Oh, I suppose at the most about 12 of them.
And until you got the tractor, how long could you work a team of horses before you'd have to take a break?
Well, I mean, we never worked longer than about 6 o'clock at night.
What were some of the chores you were responsible for when you were?
The chores?
Yeah.
Well, gathering the eggs from the hen house was one of them. And, well, after I got a little older, of course, in the summertime, we had to help with the milking because we had 10, 15 cows to milk in the summertime. Of course, for a while there, my sisters were still at home, but then after they got a little older, I was sort of the oldest one left in the family too, so I got to do every kind of chore there is.
Would you help with the house chores, like laundry and dishes? And...
Well, not, the girls did. I mean, and incidentally, the first washing machine I remember my mother had was an old wooden Maytag down in the basement. And it had a separate engine that was sitting in the corner and was belted up to this washing machine. And you carried we had what they called a cistern in the house to catch rainwater off of the roof. Of course, some of those years it didn't rain very much, so we had to haul water down the basement for washing, and after we were done washing, we hauled it back out by a bucket.
How far would you have to haul it?
Well, at the time, the water, we had a running spring, and it was at least 2 city blocks from the house.
or just you just
Well,
use the
just
spring?
those spring we had for when I was growing up, after before we got married, and we had drilled a good well on the farm. And the saddest part of it was we only needed to drill 60 feet, and we had all the water in the world. And we, for all those years, we hauled it out of the creek. Yeah. So things, but there was a lot of people worse off. I know our cousins lived out there, and their well went dry during the 30s. So they were hauling water. They had a big tank, and they were hauling water. They'd come down to our place, and of course we had this tank that was full of water from that running spring. They got it out of that tank with a bucket and put it into their tank. Now that was tough.
You know, you mentioned that the government bought the cattle during the 30s. Did the government help with any other assistance during the 30s with your family?
Well, I don't know if they were help. They gave people loans. You know, they gave loans for buying seed and for feed. But you know, a lot of these people thought it was a gift or a grant. Well, after farmers got back on their feet, the government come and collected those loans with interest. They didn't collect them all because some guys had left, but I mean, my family, they came and collected it.
Was that hard for your family to
Well, at the time, you know, they had come along financially pretty well. It wasn't really that much of a hardship. Not that they couldn't have used it for other things, but I mean, they weren't very happy with the situation, especially when they saw, you know, some guys moved out west and probably left, you know, 10 times as much in debt behind and never paid a dime of it back. And here they were trying to keep the country going, and they ended up having to pay those old loans back to the federal government.
So did your parents ever talk about the politics of that time when you were growing up?
Yes, to a degree. I know, you know, when Roosevelt was elected, that wasn't their choice. I mean, I know, you know, he did a lot for people. You know, he started that WPA project, and not saying that if the Republicans wouldn't have been in at the time that it would have got started too, but he got the credit for it. And I don't know, they still were Republicans until they died.
So were they active throughout their life in the Republican Party?
Well, just that they'd go and vote. Yeah.
Okay.
And before my mother was able to vote, because she had been born in Russia and hadn't really paid that much attention, so she had never become a citizen. The deal was with children under a certain age, when their parents homesteaded and then they became citizens, and those children of that certain age, below that age, which my mother was over that, she didn't become a citizen. She didn't realize until she wasn't a citizen when she went to try and vote the first time after they got married. And then she went through a course of study that they prescribed for her, and she became a citizen. Now, my dad had become a citizen when he had registered for the draft for the First World War. He had automatically become a citizen, but my mother never became a citizen until she was about, well, I imagine she was 30 years old.